Okay, so for part three, I'm going to go back to what we had for part two right at the bottom because this is where we're going to start. We talked about the difference between a compound sentence. Okay, this is a compound sentence. You have two independent clauses combined. And then what we had was a compound subject and a compound predicate. And technically, again, these are one idea apiece. And that period at the end makes it still a simple sentence. That's the end of their ideas. Okay, it's just one. My cat and dog are being goofy. That's it. My cat is eating and drinking. That's it. Versus the two ideas together. My cat is being cranky and my dog is being goofy. Period. Okay, there's two before we get to that period. So I wanted to start there looking at these, the compound subject and the compound predicate, because we can combine those and still only have one idea. Now this is the most, well, I shouldn't say the most, but the most technical of the compound subject's predicates. When we have a compound subject and predicate together in one main or complete idea. Okay, so what this looks like on paper is a subject plus a subject, okay, plus a predicate plus a predicate. So that means I'm going to have two subjects. I'm going to choose people because that's easiest. Sally and Gary. Okay. Now, what did Sally and Gary do? They have to do two things according to my map here. Um, ate ice cream and played softball. Okay. Period. One period. Now notice there are no commas in this, and this almost seems like, boy, it's such a technical long sentence, we should have a comma in there. No, don't think of, the length or time of a sentence to be, I need to put in a couple punctuation marks, otherwise it must be wrong. You have to know where they go, what they're used for. If we went back to our compound sentence, remember, we had the independent clause, my cat is being cranky. That was one main idea. And the reason there's a comma here is because that's the end of that one main idea, but we're not done yet. Here, we have a subject and a subject. They're doing two separate things. They ate ice cream and played softball.
There's customers for the Nimrod store. Again, there's customers for the Nimrod store.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's just compare this with the compound sentence. This is a compound subject and a compound predicate. Compound sentence, like we had over there, is going to look a little different. It's going to look like a subject plus a predicate, comma, conjunction. This could be and, it could be but, it could be or it could be a semicolon. And then we have a new compound, or a new subject and predicate. So think of it this way. You have a sentence plus a sentence in a compound sentence. Compound means more than one. So sentence plus sentence. In the compound subject and predicate, you only have one sentence. It just happens to have two people doing two things. Okay? It's not two separate ideas combined. It's two people doing two things. They're both doing the same thing together. Sally and Gary ate ice cream. Sally and Gary played softball. There's no commas in here. Now, there's kind of a general rule with the conjunctions such as and. You don't want more than two. Certainly don't want more, three or more in a sentence. Now, that's very generalized. speaking right there. Unless you get into a very complex sentence structure, it's just going to sound like a run-on if we went too far. And I'm going to give you an example of a, we'll call it a no-no here. Run-on sentence could sound something like this. Gary went to school and played trumpet with Peter. And now this is a new sentence, so I got to put and a comma there. It's compound. And Sally brought her flute. Okay? Period. So we have subject, he went to school and he played. We have two verbs. Okay? And new subject, one verb. This is a compound sentence. That's okay. Now watch what happens when I do this a little differently. Gary went to school and brought his trumpet and played with Peter, period. Okay? Now, we're borderline run-on sentence here, and I would probably label it as a run-on if students wrote this. Because listen to it. Gary went to school and brought his trumpet and played with Peter. You only have two conjunction ands here, but there's an easier, more concise way to write what we're doing here. He went to school and he brought his trumpet and he played with Peter. Can we combine it? Gary went to school, comma, brought his trumpet, running off the page here, comma, and then we're going to put one and at the end, and played with Peter, period. Now, singling down our conjunctions is much better than just stringing them together because it's more concise. In elementary, we talk about using the comma as a way to put things in a series. You know, for example, I like to eat strawberries, comma, blueberries, comma, and oranges. Okay? It's much more concise than saying I like to eat strawberries and blueberries and oranges. Okay? Because that list can sometimes be even more than 3 things. So, I guess the big thing here is to pay attention to your conjunctions, pay attention to your punctuation as well. Now, for this part 3, I'm going to take this one final step and we'll just do a quick review of what we have. We have what's called the simple sentence. This is what we talked about in part 1. The simple sentence is one main idea, okay, or a subject plus a predicate, and we saw that sometimes it's even just the predicate if it's an imperative sentence. We have the compound subjects and predicates, but still technically a simple sentence. It's either a S plus S plus P, or it's an S plus P, or it can be an S plus S plus P plus P. Sounds redundant, but if you saw the previous, that should make sense. 2 subjects, 1 predicate. We can have the compound sentence, and that is when you have a sentence plus another sentence put together before you get to that period. So usually that looks like S plus P, comma, conjunction, S plus P, period. The last step in this is known as the complex sentence. Okay. Now, in part 1 of this, we talked about the fragment, okay, also known as the dependent clause, okay? It's that phrase or clause that cannot stand by itself without something else. It's not independent, it's dependent. When you combine a DC or dependent clause plus an IC, an independent clause, then you have what's known as a complex sentence. Now, what you need to know is this IC, it could be a compound sentence, which means it would just be an IC plus an IC. It could be compound subject, it could be a compound predicate, it could be both together, or it could be just one simple sentence. So let's try the simplest version of that, which is the simple sentence up here. So we have a subject plus a predicate. Let's say the sun went down, period, okay? That's my simple sentence, and you're going to say, well, wait a minute, you didn't capitalize that. Well, I did that on purpose. The sun went down. I have a subject, and here's my verb. That's a perfectly fine main idea with a period at the end. Now, how can I put a dependent clause in the front of that? Well, let's think. I had an idea. The sun went down. I did this backwards is what I did. I want to put because in front of this, because the sun went down, and I want to turn this into my dependent clause. So the children went home because the sun went down. That's kind of what I just did it backwards. So now I have a subject of the sentence, I have a verb of the sentence, okay, and normally, if I wanted to look at where my independent clause is, it's right here, and this is my dependent clause here, because I could take this whole part out of the sentence and just say, the children went home, period. That's perfectly fine. But I can't say by itself, because the sun went down, period. That doesn't make sense. If I did, someone would say, well, whoa, okay, what happened because the sun went down? Or, what are you trying to tell me? It's the two together, the independent clause plus the dependent clause, which makes a complex sentence. Let's do one more just because I did that backwards. So that we're not confusing ourselves, let's start with the dependent clause, and since this one ended the sentence, let's put it in the front of the sentence. Because is one of those conjunctions that starts a dependent clause. Another one is since. That's a very common one. Since the team skipped practice, okay? Now, if I stopped right there and I put a period at the end of that, that doesn't make sense. It's dependent. Since the team skipped practice, and then everyone would look and say, yes, tell me the rest. Okay. Since the team skipped practice, the coach was not in a good mood. Period. Okay? Now, you kind of watch sometimes. This is an example where it starts a sentence. We call that an introductory clause. And you have to ask yourself, is there a natural pause right here? Since the team skipped practice, and you may put a comma there because that is a natural paused area. Since the team skipped practice, the coach was not in a good mood. So, check yourself. Is this complex? Well, we already talked and said this is definitely dependent clause. It's a fragment by itself. It doesn't stand alone. But what about the rest? Is this an independent clause? Well, read it alone. The coach was not in a good mood. If I wrote that down by itself, perfectly fine. That is an independent clause. We have a subject and we have a predicate. Okay. The coach was not in a good mood. Perfectly fine sentence. But, as a teacher, as a reader, the natural question would be, well, why wasn't the coach in a good mood? Why? And so, as a writer, you ask yourself these same types of questions, and you say, well, I'm going to answer that question uh, in, this way. And what you're doing is you're using variety in your sentence structure to make your writing more interesting and more detailed. Okay? You could write an independent clause, the coach was not in a good mood, period, and then after it, write a whole new independent clause. The reason the coach was mad was because the team skipped practice. But why would you do that in two different sentences if you could do it in one, following, fairly simple rules? And, we do talk in complex sentences all the time. So if you kind of find the right balance between how you talk and you know the rules to these sentence structures, this doesn't have to be too difficult.